Hello, everyone. Thank you for sticking around. I know it's been a long weekend, a lot of great conversations. It's an honor to be here, and thanks for sticking around. So without further ado, we'll get into my presentation, Weighted Bullpen Management Score Plus, Quantifying Major League Baseball Pitching Change Decision Making. A little bit about myself. My name is Sean Sullivan. I'm a graduate of the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and DePaul University, currently a data scientist at the Home Depot. If you don't like Home Depot, I work for Lowe's, so go from there. You can find me online at uramanalytics.com, as well as on Twitter at uram_analytics. Quick plug for that. I put a lot of effort into sharing sports data related jobs, as well as retweeting and sharing other people's work. So if that's of interest, definitely go and check that out. So a quick poll. It'd be great if you could raise your hand if you have ever disagreed with a pitching change decision. If you're not raising your hand, I don't believe you, but thank you for everybody. Second question would be, please raise your hand if you wish that there is a public-facing tool that aided in evaluating pitching change decision-making. Not nearly as many hands. That makes sense. This is a very specific question. I hope that if I were to ask this again at the end, we'd see more hands. So let's get into it. What made me want to do a project about pitching change decision-making? Like many of these projects here today, it came from watching baseball. It came from watching baseball with friends. We were talking about how when it comes to pitching changes, there's really not a way to get into evaluating the process. We can look at the results, but that's not always fair, right? Sometimes your decision-making may not be the best and you have a good result, or it was a good decision, but it was a bad result. So how can we take that approach and put a project together? But before doing what I eventually did, I needed to understand what's already been done. A lot of you are probably like, yeah, we've seen this before. There's been a lot of work that's looked into this space. A couple quick examples here. Greenhouse, Arthur, and Watt, they took an approach that looked more at determining if you were using your best pitcher when it mattered most. Someone like Donnie Treisman, he took an approach similar to myself, which is a little bit more at a plate appearance specific level to determine if decisions were good or not. So I tried looking at what had already been done, building off what they provided, and go from there. So what did I actually do? I had to pretend that I was a manager, put on my little fake manager hat, and think about the different parts of a pitching change decision. And for me to be able to create some sort of framework for evaluation, I needed to have data, and then I needed something to allow me to produce some sort of result. And I use a simulation program to do that. And then lastly, right, we get the results, we get to chop it up, put it in a metric so that it's easy to understand decision-making relative to others, as well as specific decision level outcomes. So you may be wondering, well, what the heck are these components? What did I determine that I believe that managers are thinking about in teams? What are they thinking about when they make a pitching change decision? I put it into a couple different buckets. The first bucket is obviously based on the players. I have an assumption here that when a team is making a pitching change, they believe that the player being inserted is going to limit runs. I also thought that the manager believes that they're also going to limit more runs than the player that they are replacing. And lastly, we still have to consider the other players available in the bullpen. So the third part of that is also assuming that they believe that the pitcher inserted will perform just about as well or better than the other players available in the bullpen. The second part of this is they have to consider the 3-batter minimum rule, right? Because they're making a pitching change. They know that they're going to have to face batters. Obviously, things like handedness splits or previous performance, things like that go into that determination. But you can't just go out after one batter and yank your pitcher and somebody else in their place. So I thought that the 3-batter minimum rule was something that should be considered here. And then lastly, you obviously have to consider the game state and therefore like the leverage index. Does this moment in the game matter? Is it important? Your decision-making, obviously should be evaluated a little bit more harshly if it is in an important situation. So what I did was I broke apart a given pitching change decision by the 3-batter minimum rule. So for every plate appearance matchup, that they would need to satisfy that rule is what I consider for this, what I'm calling component one. And what I'm doing is I'm comparing the actual pitcher chosen and how they would perform against those three batters, how the pitcher removed would perform against those three batters, and how the other pitchers available in the bullpen at that time in the game and how they would perform against those guys. You're obviously thinking to yourself, well, the first set you identified on the left, that actually happened. The ones in the middle and on the right didn't. So I had to engineer that data to allow for me to have these matchups. For the second component, it's for every subsequent plate appearance after that three batter minimum rule has been satisfied. I broke it out that way because at that time, the manager can go in and they can remove that pitcher. And I also decided not to include the previous pitcher in this portion of the evaluation because of that. In my mind, at this portion, they're already out of the game. So I'm only considering the actual pitcher as well as those available in the game. So understanding the framework, let's talk about how I got data for this. For my simulation program, I needed a single input for a given plate appearance matchup. You'll see in later slides, I go into a little bit more detail about my program. It doesn't cover every single outcome from a plate appearance, but covers most of them. So I need inputs that you see here: on base, strikeout, what I'm calling ball and play out, so on and so forth. So where did I get that from? I know there's a debate, R versus Python. Personally, I'm a Python guy. I use the PyBaseball package. Very grateful for that package. It's wonderful. And then I needed to know who was available in a bullpen on a given day. So I created a web scraping program that goes out and grabs the team roster every day from every team from ESPN. For the data that feeds into the simulation program, I wanted to account for handedness splits. I also wanted to account for times facing. And I wanted to make sure that I had quite a bit of data so that the results weren't totally terrible, which becomes a challenge, especially when you get down into those different splits, right? Where you're doing handedness as well as times facing. So what I tried to do was weigh their overall handedness split performance window for a given day with a similar performance window, but also accounting for times facing. If the player didn't meet the given thresholds that I established, then I would take a weighted average approach. I'm not going to walk through this in detail, but I wanted to provide an example, especially for someone such as Corbin Carroll, who last year was a rookie, didn't have a huge sample size, So this is how I went about generating on-base percentage. So understanding the framework, understanding that I want to get data for batters and pitchers and condense that into a single plate appearance input for all those different features for my simulation program. How did I do that? There's a bunch of different ways that you can go about calculating or trying to predict outcomes of plate appearances. I went old school, leaned into Bill James's adapted log5 method, and I ran for each plate appearance matchup, I ran those inputs through this process to generate the inputs for the simulation program. It's been pointed out in 2014 that may not be the best approach. I'm embarrassed to admit I didn't catch that until a bit later. So as I get into later, that this is still a work in progress, and I will be revisiting that. I'm actually still tinkering with it ever so slowly. So now we have our data and we have the framework. Let's talk about simulating. Like I mentioned, my simulation program is a plate appearance level simulation program. What I'm trying to do is obviously generate expected outcomes for this matchup. Using the output from the log5 methodology, we have what I'm calling my first level of a plate appearance matchup simulation, which is, are they going to reach base? Is it a ball and play that's an out, or is it a strikeout? From there, you can determine the next step. If it's a reach base event, is it a single, double, etc.? If it's a ball and play out event, what type of batted ball is it? And then I do have some base running dynamics. It's not player specific, but looking at league-wide dynamics. So things like if there's someone on first, are they only advancing one base? Are they advancing two bases? Things like that. And for this, the output of this particular plate appearance matchup simulation will get passed to the next plate appearance in the matchup set. So here's an example of what it looks like if you take a step back. In this example, we have Felix Bautista facing 3 different batters on the Rockies. The plate appearance matchup between him and Profar will be simulated, and that game state will be passed to Castro. Castro's matchup will be simulated and passed on to Toglia. And then you will log the runs scored at the end of that 3-batter sequence. And I did that 10,000 times. And the output would be the average runs scored across those different simulations. So for the 2023 season, these are the total number of simulation sets that I did. You can see that it's quite a few. It did take a while, but luckily the program isn't too slow. So let's talk about the results. The first thing that I did was I wanted to create a metric that would allow for the comparison of how teams or managers perform relative to each other. And what I'm basing this off of is each of these components, component 1, which again is the 3-batter minimum rule. Component 2 would be any subsequent plate appearance afterwards. What I'm doing is for that matchup, I want to see, okay, the actual pitcher is going to be compared to the previous pitcher. And I mentioned earlier about leverage. I'm scaling that by leverage to reward, or to penalize, depending on the game situation. For component 1, subcomponent 2, I'm actually not looking at every individual pitcher available in the bullpen. I took the median performance from that simulation set for the bullpen because I struggled with trying to figure out how do I not always yell at a team such as the Orioles for not always using Felix Bautista, which we'll get into the caveats about that in a little bit. Long story short, I then aggregate the results at a pitching change or subsequent plate appearance level for component 2, normalize it, weigh it, spit it out with a nice plus metric so you can quickly and easily understand how a team performs relative to each other. So this is for the 2023 regular season. You can see teams such as the Yankees, Reds, and Giants are all very closely grouped together there at the top. Teams such as the Rangers, Angels, Red Sox are over there at the bottom. And here on the table to make it fit, score 1 is again component 1. The part of the decision considering the 3-batter minimum rule, component 2 is score 2, every plate appearance afterwards. So what does this mean, right? It's just a plus metric, looks nice in a pretty chart. Shout out to MLB Plotar for wonderful visualization packages. Getting a little ahead of myself, actually. First thing I wanted to talk about before going into more detail on the results is, well, what happens if we take leverage out? I broke this out for component 1 by what I'm calling good process and good outcome. Good process would be for every decision when the actual pitcher is chosen and is expected to outperform both the previous pitcher and the median bullpen. And good outcome would be the actual runs allowed from that from that portion of the decision. And if it was less than the expected runs allowed, then I determined it was a good outcome. You can see good outcome on the x-axis, good process on the y. And it's interesting because you see a lot of playoff teams down there in the good outcome, poor process quadrant. And one thing I want to point out here, and I'll switch back to the previous slide, is you have teams like the Orioles and the Dodgers that, according to my framework, seem to be doing pretty well, but get hit pretty hard here with a lower ranking because of the effect that leverage is playing, meaning suggesting that their decisions are not always the best in high leverage situations. So jumping back ahead, what makes this project difficult to evaluate is that this isn't like a machine learning algorithm. There is no metric that I'm training a model against. Sure, for the simulation programs, right, it's run scored, things like that, that's easy. But for the actual metric itself, it's a little tricky. So what I'm trying to do here is help contextualize the different inputs that feed into that weighted bullpen management score plus metric. On the left-hand side, you have the leverage at the time of pitching change. And it's broken out into 4 different buckets based on the leverage. So very high, high, medium, low. And for this example, for component 1, actual pitcher versus previous pitcher, we're breaking down the simulated run difference into percentiles and then binning them into groups of 25%. So very bad would be a pitching change decision that is in the bottom 25% of those, and so on and so forth. So you can quickly compare, okay, Team X has a lot of very bad, a lot of red, a lot of dark red, and a lot of very high and high. So you can imagine that perhaps their score won't be so great. So diving into a team review, because what I think makes this interesting is you can look at a team level result and you can also look at pitching change level results. For this, we have the Yankees. We already highlighted that they were the top performing team from the 2023 regular season. And to help understand why we see this high score, you can walk through this. So for component one, if you look at leverage, that first column on the left, you'll see that they have the second highest amount of their pitching change decisions occurring in a high leverage situation. Then in their previous pitcher and pitcher versus bullpen columns, you see that this process believes that they have the highest amount of their pitching changes occurring, they have the highest amount of very good pitching changes compared to the rest of the league. So combining very good decisions made in high leverage situations, this metric really likes it. Component two is a little bit more messy, but what's not absolutely killing their score is that they have a lot of these decisions occurring in low leverage situations. So paired up with a lot of bad, it's not hurting them nearly as much. So this is what I think is the most fun part of this project, is being able to look at a pitching change level and evaluate it with this framework. Sorry to pick on the Blue Jays, but you probably made the most controversial call this year in the playoffs with Jose Berrios being removed in the third inning. And you can see here how this framework felt about the decision. It really did not like that decision. Comparing Kikuchi versus Berrios, didn't like it. Comparing Kikuchi versus who else was available in the bullpen at that time, also didn't like it. And then you could see what the expectation was compared to who else was available in the bullpen for every subsequent batter that he faced in that game. So earlier I asked to see a raise of hands if you were interested in seeing a tool that would aid in this sort of discussion. I have created a dashboard and it does have all this information, has overall rankings, component breakdown, team-specific scorecards, and my personal favorite, the specific pitching change decision tab as well. The rankings only include the 2023 regular season. The playoffs are available in the pitching change scorecard section. I don't have this posted publicly yet because I'm going to get into a couple of reasons why in the next couple slides. But if you wanted to check it out, and if you poke around, I think you'll come to agree with some of my caveats and next steps. So I'll give you another split second. So let's talk about caveats. No framework is ever perfect. And I struggled with this for a couple of years, but I said, you know what, let's just take a stab and we can get some feedback and we can make adjustments. First caveat is this relies on hypothetical matchups, which is then dependent on how I went about creating the performance window to use for inputs, the method for generating the odds for my simulation program, the simulation program itself. So there's a lot of steps that maybe people disagree with and that needs more work. For this, decisions are evaluated in a vacuum. I also struggled with this. Should I have applied some rules on, of allowing the Orioles to not be compared, not have their decisions compared when Bautista is, the Orioles maybe shouldn't be dinged for not having Bautista pitch in the sixth inning, or maybe they should. I don't know. That was something I struggled with, and I decided that I didn't want to use team patterns of how they utilize guys to impact this metric in this framework. Obviously, you still also have to consider roster health and availability. And then lastly, if you poke around, you'll come to find that this framework generally does not agree with starting pitchers being removed. And I do believe that that is directly tied to how I went about making the performance windows to feed into all those subsequent next steps. So like I alluded to earlier, I am actively working on a different approach for creating those inputs to feed into the simulation program. Jumped ahead of myself a little bit, so that's what I'm doing. I'm going to also make some dashboard edits, automate the full process so this can be available for Twitter battles on a daily basis, hopefully. And I have some blog posts with additional content and additional code and things like that, and then reveal it. So my goal is to do that at some point this spring. So thank you, especially to my wife. She's not here, but she puts up with me just being an absolute nerd and spending too much time doing this. Thank you to SABR Analytics and the committee for selecting me and allowing me to present. Thank you to Major League Baseball, High Baseball, and MLB Plot R. And lastly, thank you to you. So if there's any questions, I would love to hear them.
Thank you so much for sharing. This is such a tough topic to dive into because of like you mentioned, all the hypotheticals you're comparing against. It's hard to compare against something that never happened. You mentioned, I think when you were breaking down the Yankees, that they did worse in the lower level or lower leverage situations. And I'm wondering how you might think that relates to the other limitation that you talked about penalizing people for leaving their closer in the bullpen. That closer is always going to stimulate better than the rest of the options, but if it's only the fifth or sixth inning, and it's a lower leverage spot, that's obviously not going to be the move that people make, and probably not the right move to make. So I was wondering what you thought about that.
Yeah, I think it's something that's really difficult. And I especially struggle with it because I thought that perhaps it would start to lead to maybe selection bias isn't the right way to think about it, but playing a little bit too much into what teams are doing and then saying, hey, yeah, you do what you normally do, good job, or oh, you didn't do what you normally do, bad job. But you point to an interesting point, which I don't know if you're trying to or not, but when considering that component two, which is every additional plate appearance after the three batter minimum rule has been satisfied, as you get deeper into the game, there's less pitchers available in the bullpen to be compared against. So then as you get a little bit further, you are going to be more compared to those stronger relievers that could be driving that. So it's tricky. I don't know if I have a great answer, but if you do, definitely send me a note.
Sure.
I'd love to hear it.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Running up to him.
Hey, thank you for presenting. One question that I had is when you got those Monte Carlo probabilities for batter versus pitcher specific matchups, how did you reconcile using batter stats or pitching stats? And how did you manage to combine those to come up with the probability of two players that even if they have not matched up in the past?
So how did I just go about doing that? Or
yeah, well, like you have like the batter stats and the pitcher stats, and I'm curious, like when you come up with those probabilities, if they haven't seen each other, how do you like, what weight do you give the batter stats and the pitcher stats, and like how you kind of combine those to come up with one probability of like a single, for instance?
yeah, so the approach that was adapted from Bill James's original log five method, this is the equation that I used. I suppose it really isn't doing anything different for historical matchups for player versus player. And like I mentioned, there is literature that goes in to talk about how it may not necessarily be the best approach. So it's something I'm actively looking into. And your question, though, was something that I struggled with initially. I wasn't sure, should I include historical player A versus batter A versus pitcher A and have that be a stronger weight than their performance against specific or handedness or specific handedness and time spacing and things like that. So I don't know if I'm answering your question fully, but this is how I went about doing it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.